Thanks, everybody. Okay. So that's Danny Barker. Danny Barker was a musician, a composer, an author, an archivist, a folklorist, a raconteur, and an educator. He was a really important educator. We're not, though, going to talk about all that today. Instead, we're going to be looking at a brief exchange, really an offhand exchange, recorded in the late 1980s between Danny Barker and a Canadian filmmaker named André Gladue. It appears in a great documentary film called Liberty Street Blues, which was released in 1989. So we'll take a look at the exchange.
We also met General Martin. Lieutenant Fellow with you.
Great.
Can you all hear it? Is it loud enough? Yeah. Louder. Okay.
We also met General Martin. Lieutenant Fellow with you.
Great. That's great. What you call night people, which is different from day people. Night people. Night people have a whole theory of life different from dead people. Night people are plant nothing. They're not farmers. They're not machines. They don't build automobiles. They're night people. And they are out to get the dead people. Nightclub is a trap. When you go there, you expect to be ripped off. Is that right?
Uh-huh.
Took the waiter, took the doorman, took the cook. So you expect that. You pay more. Because you deal with night people. Night people, like I said, different from dead people. Cab driver, he allowed to put the meat on, ride 3 blocks. Or jack the meat up, or ride around 6 blocks when he should bring you 2 blocks. You know all those tricks that's involved with night people.
Okay. I love that. So
We also met General Martin.
all right. So I was reminded about this clip from a Facebook post by this terrific person, Ben Sandell. I have a lot to say about it. The thing to know, though, is that this is a repertoire story. Danny Barker liked to talk about day and night people. Versions of this story appear in other interviews, conference proceedings, and in books he has published. It can be fun to divide your friends and people you know into day people and night people. Like Pierre is a day person. Yeah, Pierre is a day person. At least when he's in Munich. Yeah, I'm a night person. It's good. But Barker, though, is mainly thinking not about natural categories into which people can be sorted. He said it was possible for the same individual to act like day people sometimes and like night people other times. Indeed, Barker celebrated his own ability to move among different worlds. Molly Cleaver, a researcher at the Historic New Orleans Collection, has published a great article on how Barker would change his voice to match an occasion. He had a day person voice, a night person voice, other voices. A flexible approach to self-presentation that he would also take in his writing. When Barker talks about day people and night people then, he's less interested in fixing the essential nature of actual people than in exploring personae, or perhaps more precisely, archetypes. Considered as an archetype, the night person is a trickster, obviously. A character who lives by their wits, practicing misdirection, deceiving their enemies, seizing every small advantage. As you all know, the trickster tradition has deep roots in Africa, in the Americas, in Europe, and in Asia, as well as many other places throughout the world. Now, Barker's cab driver obviously belongs to this trickster tradition. The driver engages in deception to increase the fare paid by the day people in the back seat, exemplifying what Barker calls all the old tricks associated with night people. Night people are less wealthy and powerful than day people, but they charm and manipulate and cheat and steal to get what they need to survive. This much is pretty obvious. In this talk today, I'm interested more specifically in how Danny Barker adapts this global trickster tradition to a more specific purpose. Barker's thinking about night people is specifically attuned to life and labor in New Orleans, the city where he was born and spent most of his life, even as it also offers an original account of political economy, what Barker calls a whole theory of life, grounded very specifically in his own personal experience of the service industry. Okay, so let's return to Barker's definition of night people. Night people have a whole theory of life different from day people. Night people don't plant nothing. They're not farmers. They're not machinists. They don't build automobiles. They're night people, and they are out to get the day people. Okay, so at first then, the difference between night people and day people may seem self-evident, right? You know these people when you see them. Day people work 9-to-5 jobs and they live respectably. Night people are waiters, cooks, cab drivers, musicians, all kinds of entertainers, prostitutes, pimps, gamblers, and petty criminals. Again, it feels like you know these people when you see them. Things become more complex, however, when we consider the history of these archetypes, the history that makes them feel obvious. Think, for example, about the familiar aphorisms from Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac. This was a serial publication that advised readers aspiring to upward mobility, communicating its life lessons by dramatizing the character contrasts between two essential types of people. People on the one hand who are hardworking, thrifty, virtuous, and forward-thinking, and on the other hand, people who are lazy, wasteful, self-indulgent, and dishonest. Franklin often used a shorthand to characterize these people as early risers and late sleepers, or as Barker would say, day people and night people. So, early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. Plow deep while sluggards sleep, and you shall have corn to sell and to keep. Sloth makes all things difficult, but industry all easy. Okay. So in these aphorisms, two characters, the industrious, early rising planter and the lazy, struggling sluggard, are inserted into a morality tale where virtue is rewarded and vice is punished. It's easy to see here the conceptual interdependence of these character types. The day person's industry is defined against the night person's shiftlessness. The day person's calculating capacity to defer gratification is defined against the night person's self-indulgence. And the day person's graduated development is defined against the night person's inevitable decline. During the 18th and 19th centuries, day people and night people proliferated across a variety of writings promoting the science of political economy, including, for example, Harriet Martineau's Illustrations of Political Economy, a serial whose vignettes draw a character contrast between people who are, quote, cheerful and virtuous, and others who are, quote, mournful and depraved. We might think also about novels of upward mobility by Horatio Alger, or memoirs by self-made men like Andrew Carnegie, or indeed writings by political reformers like Booker T. Washington. We have Washington. The silly, uneducated Negro puts his pay on his back. The business Negro puts his pay in the bank. Sacrifice today's indulgence for tomorrow's independence. So again, we have here the same character types and the same morality tale in parallel construction, importantly, right? It sounds like an echo of Franklin in an interesting way. These character types are also, though, put to use more systematically within natural rights philosophy and in writings by classical economists on the division of labor, productivity, and free markets. Take, for example, John Locke's second treatise of civil government. Locke is interested in many things in this treatise. One of them is the origin of government. Where does government come from? Locke wants to know. Locke answers this question by telling a story about people in a primordial state of nature. The story focuses on a person who is diligent and thrifty, a person who, for example, plants wheat in the ground, mixing their labor with nature, thereby gaining a natural right to the produce they have grown and harvested. Locke, however, points out that there is also another type of person in a state of nature, a person who is lazy, who drinks wine and sings songs all the time. Having wasted their time in riotous living, this lazy person eventually has no food to eat and resorts to lying, cheating, and stealing from his virtuous neighbors. Locke believes there's no solution to the problem of the insecurity of private property in the state of nature. Lazy people will keep on stealing from hardworking people, eventually leading to chaos. The only solution to this problem is to invent a government with the authority and capacity to protect private property. So, in Danny Barker's terms, we might say that Locke explains the emergence of government by staging a colorful and ultimately intractable conflict between day people and night people. Okay. One more example. Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. Smith is interested in many things in this very long treatise. One of them is the origin of capitalism. Where does capitalism come from? Smith wants to know. Like Locke, Smith considers this question of origin as a philosophical concern rather than as an occasion for historical investigation. Smith answers this question by telling a story about two types of people. The first are people who work hard enough to produce more than they need to survive. These people are not only industrious, they are frugal, right? They don't go and spend their surplus on fine clothes. Instead, they accumulate wealth. The second type of people are lazy rascals. They waste their time and their resources until eventually they are bereft. According to Smith, it is the encounter between these two people on the stage of history, one person with money to invest and the other person with nothing other than their own labor to sell, that leads to the invention of the wage contract. So, in Danny Barker's terms, we might say that Adam Smith explains the origin of capitalism by staging a fateful encounter on the stage of history between a day person and a night person. So for Locke, the encounter between day people and night people is the origin story for government. And for Smith, the encounter between day people and night people is the origin story for capitalism. It's sometimes observed that these origin stories are told in a way that erases the perspective of the night people, right? Locke and Smith, in other words, tell stories about how society came to be organized around private property backed by government. Or, in Danny Barker's terms, how society came to be structured around the self-interest of day people. These stories, however, are not only about the day people winning their battle against the night people. They are also told from the point of view of the day people. History is written by the victors, we are sometimes told. The point of view of the night people is blocked out in these stories. How night people saw themselves and their place in the world, how they saw their relationship to the earth before someone else staked an exclusive claim to its produce, how they organized themselves and negotiated with their neighbors. These are questions that we are not allowed to ask by Locke and Smith. Defined by their moral failure, night people are caricatured to serve a didactic purpose in a cautionary tale. So, Clearly, part of what Barker is doing in his own storytelling is recovering the perspective of the night person. He aims to show that night people have wisdom, charisma, stamina, and dignity. Interestingly, however, Barker does not make his case directly. He does not challenge the terms in which night people have been stigmatized. Indeed, on first glance, he appears to accept those terms in his stories about day people being ripped off by cab drivers and small-time hustlers. Again, cab driver, he liable not to put the meter on, ride 3 blocks, or jack the meter up, ride around 6 blocks, when he should bring you 2 blocks. Clearly, we are dealing here with a lazy rascal who is happy to cheat to gain advantage. The cab driver looks an awful lot like the thief who steals from his neighbors in Locke's State of Nature, or like the charlatans and swindlers who populate stories by Harriet Martineau and Horatio Alger. Look also at the pronouns. The cab driver is described in the third person as he. We are not seeing the situation through the cab driver's eyes. We're seeing it from the perspective of the day person riding in the back seat, who is named in the second person as you. Given that Barker's intention is to recover the perspective of the night person, it seems a little strange that he structures his anecdotes from the perspective of the day person. This is true in the nightclub too. A nightclub is a trap. When you go in there, you expect to be ripped off. That right? Tip the waiter, tip the doorman, tip the cook. So you expect that. You pay more because you're dealing with night people. We're not seeing the situation from the perspective of the waiter, doorman, or cook. Everything is focused through the point of view of the day person. Again, you, who moves through the nightclub. All the verbs, moreover, expect, tip, and pay, are actions performed by the day person. The syntax, in other words, identifies the day person as a subject and the night person as an object. But if we look closely here, I believe we can see how Barker begins to insinuate another perspective in this anecdote. Think about it this way. The nightclub is clearly a workplace. There are well-defined jobs, waiters, doormen, cooks, named here, and it is easy to intuit others. Coat checkers, bartenders, busboys, dishwashers, bathroom attendants, musicians, dancers, all kinds of entertainers. All of them with carefully orchestrated interlocking roles that can be divided into front of house and back of house. If night people are supposed to be lazy rascals, it turns out these people are working hard, right? This would seem to be a paradox, but it starts to make some sense when we focus on the types of labor performed in the various stories told about day and night people. When thinkers like Benjamin Franklin imagined the contrast between labor and laziness, they were not actually talking about labor in general. They were talking very specifically about labor that leads to the creation of tangible commodities with immediate utility and exchange value. Okay? Think back to Franklin. Plow deep while sluggards sleep, and you shall have corn to sell and to keep. Right? It's no coincidence that Franklin chooses agriculture here as his paradigm for labor in general. Locke does the same thing when he talks about how mixing labor with nature, by say planting wheat, creates a natural right to property. Right? So they are thinking through a specific so-called producerist paradigm for labor, not about labor in general. Now, as we've seen, right, night people don't plant nothing, they're not farmers, they're not machinists. Barker draws the same contrast as Locke and Franklin when he defines night people. Barker explains night people are different from day people in that they do not produce tangible commodities such as staple crops and automobiles, right? I think there's something interesting he's doing here too, which is that Barker creates the expectation that he's going to give us a parallel construction, right? Like those we've seen in Benjamin Franklin or Booker T. Washington. But in this case, Barker sets this expectation only to break it. Barker tells us who night people are not. They are not farmers or machinists, but he does not tell us who they are. Barker defines day people on their own terms, via the productive labor of agriculture and manufacture, but he defines night people only negatively in their conceptual opposition and actually existing antagonism to day people. He does not, crucially, go on to talk about the laziness and self-indulgence of night people. This has an interesting effect, I think. It's as if he leaves us waiting for the other shoe to drop. In this manner, I might suggest, Barker leaves open a space into which the night person's perspective can be insinuated in his ensuing stories about service industry workers like waiters and cab drivers. And this is the crucial substitution. Rather than contrasting workers to non-workers, Barker draws a more precise contrast between agriculture and industrial, or so-called productive labor on the one hand, and service industry labor on the other hand. And everything looks different from the vantage of the service industry, right? We can see things that previously we could not. For example, we can tell maybe the reason you wake up late is that you were working all night, right? That possibility is unthinkable to Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard, for whom daytime is wholly associated with labor and nighttime is wholly associated with leisure. As another example, think again about the nightclub. For day people, it might seem like a trap. It might feel like you're getting ripped off as you are solicited again and again by doormen and waiters and cooks. For night people, however, this is a workplace. And it is a workplace where laborers are paid little, if anything, in hourly wages and are expected to make their money in tips. If these tips seem like a shakedown or even small-time graft to the day person, they look like fair payment for service rendered from the perspective of the busy workers buzzing about the club. These people are not thieves, and they're certainly not lazy. They're workers whose service labor, cooking, cleaning, hosting, entertaining, is slighted and stigmatized in classical political economy when it's not ignored or erased outright. Crucially, it's no coincidence that from Ben Franklin's time to our time, all types of service labor are disproportionately performed by women and people of color. Political economy's failure to account for the service industry is a failure to account for the ways in which the division of labor under capitalism is organized along lines of race and gender as well as class. Barker's reflections on night and day, or darkness and light, begins to redress this failure by alluding to the ways in which moral economy is color-coded. Barker also suggests that the tension between day people and night people in the club is functional and even friendly. He makes the crucial point that day people go to the club expecting to be ripped off. They may even enjoy being ripped off, right? As service workers empty the pockets of their patrons, the tension never reaches a breaking point. The same may also be the case in the cab. Maybe if the driver is regaling you with colorful stories about the ways of night people, you don't mind taking the scenic route. Or maybe you do mind, but not enough to cause a fight. The simmering tension in the nightclub contrasts with the high-stakes conflicts in the stories told by Locke and Smith, in which, you will recall, the battle between day people and night people proves so intense that it threatens the collapse of society, necessitating a total transformation in economy and government. If Locke and Smith imagine a state of war between day people and night people to explain the emergence of the modern world system, Barker sees their conflict as tending toward a dynamic equilibrium. There's real tension, but it is functional and sustainable rather than destructive and transformative. The tension between day people and night people, according to Barker, is what makes the world go round. Night follows day and day follows night in a natural cycle, each turning into the other as characters reverse roles of work and leisure. What Barker says in the clip from Liberty Street Blues is important, but equally important, I would say, is how he says what he says. His raised eyebrows, playful eye contact, his pausing for assent or emphasis, his bowing and smiling, the way he rides out the broken rhythm of his phrases, all of these things bring a magnetism and cosmopolitan worldliness to his performance, at the same time as they also invest the character of the night person with these same charismatic qualities. In other words, Barker is not only talking about night people in this scene, he is also personifying or acting out the role of the night person. By implication, the director, André Gladue, serves in this encounter as the archetypal day person. When Barker says you, right, he uses the personal pronoun to suggest a general perspective, right, of the person going into the nightclub or sitting in the back of the cab. But I think it's important that he is also at the same time saying, you, André Gladue, when you go to a nightclub, this is what it is like, right? He's made to play the day person to Barker's night person. So Barker is speaking in this encounter, I think it's clear, as a night person to a day person. And this performance, more than anything else, makes available the night person's perspective within stories whose structure and syntax retain the opposing point of view, right? When Barker then speaks here, he's not only acting out an archetype, he's also miming the role of the cab driver, the doorman, the cook, and the waiter, implying through indirection how the voices of these night people sound, even as the vignettes he shares do not admit their point of view. At the same time, I think there are interesting ways in which Barker is also brooding on the ethnographic situation that's happening in this documentary film. Something that becomes increasingly apparent when we consider the question that prompts Barker's reflection. Gladue asks him, you also met Jelly Roll Morton. What kind of fellow was he? Right. So, obviously there's a lot to say about Jelly Roll Morton, right? Who's a world historically important musician, composer, and band leader. But Barker really doesn't want to talk about all that. Instead, what he says is that Jelly Roll Morton was night people, right? Great. Lived great. He was what you call night people, right? Barker's reply quickly begins to feel like a non sequitur, right? He's offering this kind of free-form meditation on human history through the archetypes of day people and night people. It's not very clear, though, what this has to do with Jelly Roll Morton, right? I would say even though it feels like a non sequitur, there is actually an important way to link Gladue's question to Barker's answer. But it requires a little bit of a detour for us. We need to understand the relationship between the question and the answer. We need to consider an exchange that happened a few years before Liberty Street Blues was filmed. A more heated exchange in which the subtle antagonism that always runs through the discourse on night people bursts into the open. I'm referring to an exchange between Alan Lomax and Danny Barker at the 1982 Jelly Roll Morton Symposium at Tulane University. Lomax and Barker got into an argument about the nature of jazz. Lomax held that it was African. Barker held that it was African-American. In response to the increasingly academic tone of the debate, Barker made this statement. You're saying these things, but you're not saying them about the people Jelly Roll was entertaining. These are people in what was called a cabaret. They're night people. They're not day people. They're waiting for you, who is a fool. Is that enough? Right. So Barker's point here is first that the academic discourse of ethnomusicology was too far removed from the circumstances of Jelly Roll Morton's playing to tell us anything useful about his music. Barker uses the term night people to describe the social milieu of the cabaret, and he uses the term day people to describe the academics in the room far removed from this social milieu. And then he does something fascinating, which is to project his interlocutor, Alan Lomax, into the scene of the cabaret, casting him as the day person about to get fleeced by the night people. Right? So there is so much to say about the argument between Barker and Lomax. But my main concern right now is how that earlier exchange can help us to understand why Barker's response to André Gladue a few years later was not, in fact, a non sequitur. In his exchange with Gladue, Barker is playing the trickster. He's playing the night person to Gladou's day person. He's playing the night person to Gladou's day person in refusing to answer directly. Gladue wants an answer he can extract and put to use in his film, but Barker answers the question not with a memory or canned biography, but instead with a reflection on what Gladue would need to know before Barker can give him a straight answer. The key here is recognizing how Barker is repeating the substitution he made at the symposium when he cast Lomax as a hayseed wandering into a nightclub. Like Lomax, Gladue does not know the first thing about the situation or the music that is endemic to it. Okay? And so then what Gladue needs to understand before he can start to learn something about Morton is everything. What he needs to assimilate is nothing less than a, quote, whole theory of life, to quote Barker. The whole history of the world that is implied by the conflict between night people and day people. The exchange in Liberty Street Blues does not have as much fire as the argument at the symposium, but in both cases, Barker makes the same points. In all cases, Barker is clear that day people do not understand night people, and moreover, day people really do not understand how the world works. This is seen in face-to-face encounters, and it is also seen in the assumptions made by day people about the ethics of capitalism. When we consider Barker's self-presentation and direct address to his interlocutors, we see that he invokes night and day people to reflect not only on the relationship between the lazy rascal and the proto-capitalist in the discourse of classical political economy, but also at the same time on the relative positions occupied by the native informant and the collector in the ethnographic encounter. In his talking, his playing, and his writing, Barker reinvents these old archetypes on the fly to revel in the insights of night people who recognize injustice and exploitation, even as they also lean into the ambiguity and the sweetness of everyday life. That's a New Orleans story.